Hello and welcome to Ashrit Parvangada's Tipping Points, a podcast where we look at tipping points that brought us to where we are today. In our last episode of the season, Mansa Musa had gathered an army of followers, slaves, and camels and is heading for a pilgrimage to Mecca. He has the side objective, or perhaps the real objective, of joining the club of international Islamic celebrities and becoming a name known as a great sultan of the world. He wants to be famous. This episode is called Be Careful What You Wish For, and it's episode 2 of the season, Red Lands, Black Hands. Here we go. I mentioned before that he brought a lot of gold with him, but for me, a lot of gold is a 1 kilogram bar of gold. A gold watch is a lot of gold. So what exactly does a lot of gold mean? Nothing like some cold, hard numbers to put things in perspective. He had 80 camels with him, each carrying somewhere between 23 and 136 kilograms of gold. So, at the very least, something like 2 tons of gold on the camels, if not significantly more. He had 12,000 slaves, each slave carrying a 1.4 kilogram bar of gold. All 60,000 followers of his wore fine clothes, Persian silks, and brocade. We think this isn't a big deal now, but think of silk back in the day like wearing high-end designer clothes. It's one of the finest things that money can buy. So 60,000 people in the medieval equivalent of Louis Vuitton, top to bottom. In front of him walked a special delegation of 500 slaves, each of whom carried a gold-adorned staff. So altogether, with somewhat low estimates, let's say he has something in the range of 15 to 20 tons of gold with him. How much is it compared to something like a country or an empire? As a comparison, in the year that we're looking at when Mansa Musa is doing his trip, 1324, the annual revenue of the Byzantine Empire, according to W. Treadgold in his History of the Byzantine State and Society, their annual revenue is something like 8 tons of gold per year. Mansa Musa is carrying double that, 15 tons, just as his holiday budget. Okay, so from an absolute numbers perspective, he has a veritable shitload of gold, but you also have to remember that the vast majority of people in this era have never seen much outside of their local area or their village, or if they lived in a big city, then their big city. There's no internet where you can look up the richest people in the world. Most people are probably illiterate, so it's not like they could go to a library and read about the richest people in the world. And even if they did, it's not like the libraries would have that kind of information. Try to imagine being a medieval peasant who plays with stones for fun. You probably make a few gold coins a year. One day, you watch an army of 60,000 people adorned in fine silks, right? Medieval Louis Vuitton, just walking by. They're all carrying gold, or many of them are carrying gold. And at their head, there's 500 special people with gold staffs, behind whom is a king who's probably decked out head to toe in gold. How would you even process that? And bedazzlement was exactly Mansa Musa's intention. Look at me, I'm rich. Know my kingdom. Mansa Musa would cross 4,300 kilometers on his pilgrimage. So he would be passing by a lot of peasants and villages on his way, dazzling every single one of them. A medieval tour de force. As he traveled, he even gave gold away to the poor. He gave gold to the cities he passed, including eventually when he gets to Cairo and Medina, which are big cities. He used gold to buy souvenirs for back home. He's more or less just dropping gold wherever he goes. Can you imagine if a billionaire did that today? Here's $10,000 just for crossing my path. Have a good life. Oh, that's a nice souvenir of the Eiffel Tower you have there. Here's $100,000 for it. Thank you very much, sir. Just changing lives as you pass people by. He arrives in Cairo in July of 1324 and stays in the city for 3 months, gifting people, donating, shopping. It was like a medieval trip to Dubai and you're the richest person on earth. But I'll let someone from that time describe it for you. The Arab historian Al-Umari visits Cairo 12 years after Mansa Musa's visit. He says, quote, "From the beginning of my coming to stay in Egypt, I heard talk of the arrival of this Sultan Musa on his pilgrimage and found the Cairenes eager to recount what they had seen of the Africans' prodigal spending. I asked the Emir Abu, and he told me of the opulence, many virtues and piety of the Sultan." Stop quote. So 12 years later, people are still talking about Mansa Musa in Cairo. The Emir, who tells Al-Umari the story, a noble himself, so he's probably rich by the standards of his city, goes out to meet with Mansa Musa on behalf of the Mamluk Sultan, the emperor of the Mamluks. I quote, "When I went out to meet him on behalf of the mighty Sultan al-Nasir, he did me the extreme honor and treated me with the greatest courtesy. He addressed me, however, only through an interpreter, despite his perfect ability to speak in the Arabic tongue. Then he forwarded to the royal treasury many loads of unworked native gold and other valuables." Stop quote. So Mansa Musa isn't just giving gold to the poor, he's giving it to the royal treasury of the Sultan al-Nasir himself, before even having met the Sultan. Of course, the Sultan al-Nasir wants to meet with Mansa Musa. So his representative, the Emir, tries to convince Mansa Musa to pay the Sultan a visit. I quote, "I tried to persuade him to go up to the citadel to meet the Sultan, but he refused persistently, saying, 'I came for the pilgrimage and nothing else. I do not wish to mix anything else with my pilgrimage.' He had begun to use this argument, but I realized that the audience was repugnant to him because he would be obliged to kiss the ground and the Sultan's hand." Stop quote. Mansa Musa doesn't want to visit the Sultan because he would be forced to kiss the ground and the Sultan's hand. That's the sign of respect that a lesser king would have to give to a greater king. And Mansa Musa is doing this whole trip to cement his place as a great king. So he can't be going around kissing anyone's hand, even a great king like al-Nasir. And it's worth digressing for a moment just to reinforce how great a king al-Nasir really was. Because until now in our story, he's just a name. Another guy with a turban. But he was unmistakably to his people and to the world and perhaps even to Europeans of the time a great king, a hero even. Well, to the Europeans perhaps a villain. And here's why. Al-Nasir's father was a great conqueror, also an emperor of the Mamluks, who expanded the Muslim domains in the Crusades. His father also beat back the Mongols a few times. The Mamluks were some of the few peoples in the world who beat back the Mongols. His father took in plenty of Mongol warriors as slaves as well. The word Mamluk, the Mamluk Empire, Mamluk Sultan, the word Mamluk means owned slave. So the Mamluk Sultanate is something like a slave empire. Historians call it this because they would capture slaves, train them in culture and arts, and in Islamic arts as well. And then they would free the slaves, and the slaves would become the upper caste of society in the Mamluk Empire. They didn't call themselves the Mamluk Empire, but this is the way history knows them. So An-Nasr's father would do great things, and eventually he would pass away, and An-Nasr's older brother would take over. But he's assassinated soon after by one of the freed Mongol slaves who the father had taken in. And that Mongol slave decides to put An-Nasr on the throne as a 9-year-old boy, probably fearing for his life every day because he's just a puppet king. And if the Mongol slave assassin, his name is Kitbuga, if Kitbuga feels like he can handle the throne without the puppet king, he would probably kill An-Nasr just like he killed his older brother. Eventually, Kitbuga beats back a revolt and thinks he has enough political clout to handle the throne by himself, without the legitimacy of An-Nasr. So he gets rid of An-Nasr, not by killing him, he sends him away, and An-Nasr lives with his mother for the next 5 years. Likely still fearing for his life, because every day Kitbuga is probably thinking, if I just kill him, there won't be any real king left. It'll just be me. Well, things don't last too long for Kitbuga. Eventually, there's another set of coups and assassination attempts in the palace, the power changes, and the emirs, rulers, who end up on top, think that An-Nasr is a legitimate puppet to put on the throne again. This time, An-Nasr is a 14-year-old boy. During his second reign, he would meet an older king of the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa's predecessor, named Mansa Sakura. Mansa Sakura, when he met An-Nasr, kissed the floor and kissed the Sultan's hand. So it's only natural that later in life, he'd expect the same from Mansa Musa. But An-Nasr's story gets even better. During An-Nasr's second reign, he was undoubtedly exposed to politics, war, revolts, so he learned a lot. And one day, 10 years after starting his second reign, so he starts when he's 14, so this is around the time he's 24, the politics of the court have shifted again, such that he suspects that he's going to be deposed or killed. So he tells everybody he's going for a pilgrimage and he runs away back to his mother. But this time is different. He's in his mid-20s, probably planning his revenge, and for the first time of his life, he's taken control and made a major decision. Nobody deposed him, nobody sent him away like, go away little boy, go live with your mom. He ran away. The guy who An-Nasr was afraid would assassinate him takes the throne, but is seriously unpopular with the people of the Mamluk Empire. At the same time, that guy would get unlucky and would have to fight crusaders and Mongols and revolts, and he can't handle it. 11 months into this reign of this usurper, the guy steps down from the throne, and the only guy left who can refill the throne is An-Nasr. Puppet king for a third time, right? Not quite. Order number 1, kill the guy who just stepped down. An-Nasr is going to be no one's puppet in round 3. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Order number 1, dead. Now An-Nasr's back for a third time. The people of Egypt are probably more or less aware of the crazy journey that An-Nasr has been through up until this point. So when he returns, it's a bit like a hero returning home. This is the rightful heir of the great, his father, whose name was Qalawun. Qalawun's rightful heir coming back, taking his place on the throne, but all eyes are on him. How's he going to do this time? Who's going to puppet him this time around? Well, nobody. An-Nasr starts accepting resignations of people who he doesn't trust, and there's a lot of those people from his first 2 reigns, and he replaces those people with his own people. Very common political strategy, right? Donald Trump comes into office, put my people in there, put Mike Pence in there, put Pompeo in there. So not only does he accept resignations of people, he uses the propaganda of seizing the property of corrupt officials. And let's be fair, the officials probably were corrupt, but which politician isn't, right? But it's in these targeted corruption purges that he ends up arresting a whole bunch of his rivals and more people he doesn't trust. And these targeted corruption purges are a time-tested strategy in politics, right? You see it in many countries. In China, Xi Jinping doesn't like some rivals. He'll say he's on a corruption purge and arrest that guy and seize his house, and he'll put someone else in his place. It happens in loads of countries today. An-Nasser would then sponsor public works. He would abolish the execution of prisoners and more. So he's in here arresting corrupt people, changing the law for the good. He's cementing his image in the eyes of the people as a leader who can get things done, and it's probably so that nobody can ever challenge his legitimacy to the throne again. He learned his lesson twice, and he's not going to learn it a third time. An-Nasser's reign would go on for 31 years, one of the longest reigns of any Mamluk Sultan. He would preside over economic prosperity, military victories, stability. 31 years is remarkable, considering how things went for him the last couple of times around, and also for his brother who got assassinated, and for the sultans in between, who themselves either got assassinated or kicked out. It's a cutthroat world out there being a sultan. And An-Nasser would go on to be sultan 31 years this third time. But 15 years into his stellar third reign, now a lot of interesting stuff would happen throughout his reign, but 15 years in 1324, Mansa Musa walks into his town and is spending all this money. Right, so you're king of the land, you've shown the world you're a hero, and you're 15 years into the best time as CEO of Mamluk Inc. And this rich dude shows up in your town and starts blowing money and just drops gold in your treasury, and he isn't even going to come to visit you? No, no, no. You can't just let this guy walk through. And you have to show him, just like his predecessor before him, Mansa Sakura, that he's the lesser king going through the land of the great Mamluk Sultan. Yeah, he has money and he's flashy, but you're like the Pope meets King Charles meets John Wick. A popular icon, a legend. It makes you wonder just how much it got to his head. But regardless, Mansa Musa is going to pay him a visit. So the emir that the sultan sends, who was telling the story about Mansa Musa, after being refused a few times, says, quote, "He continued to make excuses, but the sultan's protocol demanded that I should bring him into the royal presence. So I kept on at him until he agreed. When we came into the sultan's presence, we said to him, 'Kiss the ground.' But he refused, outright saying, 'How may this be?'" Stop quote. From Mansa Musa's perspective, he's not coming in as a lesser king. Let's put ourselves in his shoes for a moment. You represent your people. You spent more money than most empires make in a year and traveled for thousands of kilometers, building a reputation, and this is all for the sole reason of being treated as a great king by the world. And when you walk into the room, the Mamluk Sultan gives you an order like this, what would you do? Would you do it? But, of course, the Mansa Musa's first reaction is to say no. He just refuses. Continuing Al-Umari's quote of the emir, quote, "Then an intelligent man who was with him whispered to him something we could not understand. And he, Mansa Musa, said, 'I make obeisance to the God who created me,' and then prostrated himself and went forward to the Sultan. The Sultan half rose to greet him and sat him by his side." Stop quote. So some intelligent man by Mansa Musa's side, maybe an advisor, maybe an elder, right? Maybe an older brother, an uncle, we don't know, tells him something. A whisper. Nobody could understand. But there's no getting around one thing. Mansa Musa needs Sultan An-Nasser more than the Sultan needs him. An-Nasser controls the Mamluk Empire, which controls trade routes that go from Asia, right, India, Persia, China, where the good stuff is made, into Africa. Mansa Musa needs access to Middle Eastern markets. His followers are all wearing Persian silks, after all. They have to get those silks from Persia. and it has to go through Egypt. So the Sultan has the power, in other words, to sanction Mansa Musa the way the USA sanctions Russian oligarchs today. All the money in the world can't help you if you can't spend it. So finally, Mansa Musa prostrates himself to the floor, but to make himself look better, he says, "I'm explicitly doing this for Allah. I make obeisance to God who created me. I'm bowing to God and I just happen to be in front of you while I'm doing what I do every day." A pretty smart solution, I guess you could say, but it's gotta be embarrassing. You represent a kingdom. You brought 60,000 of your people with you. Some of them are watching, and for sure, the ones who are watching are going to go and tell the rest of them. And now they all know that their king bows to another. Can you imagine if you have rivals back home? King Mansa Musa bowed to someone else. They can suddenly start questioning you. So you think, okay, that was bad, but whatever, the rest of the trip's gonna go great, right? Wrong. Mansa Musa would go on to Mecca and would spend so much money on the way there and back that he runs out of gold. And when he stops by in Cairo on the way back, Sultan An-Nasir has to give him gifts to keep him afloat, cementing his position in this battle of ego. It's not cheap to take care of 60,000 people following you. You gotta feed them, clothe them, pay for their entertainment, and Mansa Musa paid for all of it. It was like a company-sponsored trip all on one guy. But when he runs out of money, he still needs money to pay for 60,000 people. So Mansa Musa not only accepts gifts from the Sultan, but has to take loans from the other emirs in Mamluk territory, which of course he'll pay back, and I don't think anyone was worried about that. He has to sell the souvenirs he bought, but he sells them at a much lower price than he bought them for, right? When he was buying them, he was like, here's 100 grand just for your Eiffel Tower toy. But when he's buying them back, nobody's that stupid, right? Or rather, when he's selling them, nobody's that dumb. Nobody's going to buy back an Eiffel Tower toy for a bar of gold or whatever it was Mansa Musa bought it for. So he essentially just loses a whole bunch of money. His return trip is a bit of a disaster, all in all. And let's just say he couldn't have been feeling very good. Mansa Musa would get back to Mali, would make a butt-ton more money, because he owns the gold mines. He would die in the year 1337, a bit more than a decade after his trip. A successful king in Mali, he grew the empire, but with some embarrassing moments that maybe were replaying in his head every night that kept him up. I mean, I still can't forget that one time I said something stupid at the company meeting. Can you picture having bowed and kissed the floor in front of all the most important people? Well, at least you're rich, right? And then running out of money and asking those same people for money later? Oh my gosh, that's gotta be embarrassing. It's gotta keep you up at night. Maybe to compensate for that shitty feeling, you go and conquer another empire and expand your empire. You want to feel like the man. So he does it. And by the way, this isn't something he wrote down in his diary or anything that we found. This is just me trying to put myself in another human being's shoes. But posthumously, Mansa Musa's reputation would go on to be more successful than he could have ever imagined in his wildest dreams. And his reputation would become most successful in a place he probably thought very little about: Europe. Continuing the last bit of Alumari's quote, 12 years after Mansa Musa's visit, this historian Alumari goes to Cairo, and he talks about how the legend spread. Quote, "This man flooded Cairo with his benefactions. He left no court emir nor holder of a royal office without the gift of a load of gold. They spent gold until they depressed its value in Egypt and caused its price to fall. Gold was at a high price in Egypt until they came in that year. The mitkal did not go below 25 dirhams and was generally above." So mitkal, I'm guessing, is some sort of gold. But from that time, its value fell and it cheapened in price, and has remained cheap until now. The mitkal does not exceed 22 dirhams or less. This has been the state of affairs for about 12 years until this day, by reason of the large amount of gold which they brought into Egypt and spent there. End quote. Can you imagine one person spends so much money in your country or city that money has a 20% inflation for 12 years before it starts to go back to what it used to be? It would be a national catastrophe. So his tale spreads like wildfire to the castles of Europe. And literally within years, Mansa Musa's name is a legend in the courts and universities of Europe. Maps are made dreaming about where Mali might be, at a time where Europe had no idea what was even south of Morocco. The earliest of these maps that we still have access to is Angelino Dulcert's map of 1339. You can look it up to this day, and if you zoom in on the southwestern tip of this map, you'll see none other than Mansa Musa. With one glaring inaccuracy, he's white. Right? They probably thought that the Mamluks and people in North Africa were not black people. They were Arabs, so I guess everyone in Africa looks like that. Just to put things in perspective, Europeans in the mid-1300s knew very little about the world beyond the Mediterranean Sea. And that had been the case since Roman times. What Europeans considered the point of no return from a maritime perspective is called Cape Bojador. You can look it up on a map. You'd be surprised by how close it is to Spain and Portugal. It's literally near the southern tip of Morocco, just past the Canary Islands, which are islands that even the Greeks and Carthaginians had visited more than 1,000 years before. The name Cape Bojador comes from the Arab word Abu Khatar, which means father of danger. If you pronounce Abu Khatar in Spanish, it sounds a bit like Bojador. Many European vessels had tried to cross it and were never seen or heard from again, which led people to think there were sea monsters there. If you look up Roman maps of Strabo or Pomponius Mela, which date more than 1,000 years before this time, they look pretty much the same in terms of how much they knew about the world. There was a concept of the Romans called something like non plus ultra, which means nothing beyond this point, which was still the thinking in Europe in the 1300s. So, this Majorcan map of 1339 motivates a Majorcan adventurer named Juan Ferrer to set out 7 years later, after the map is made. So he sets out in 1346 on a journey past the point of no return. So he's going to Cape Bojador. And he's motivated specifically by Mansa Musa. It's maybe even worth the risk of the Cape of Danger, which all of your continent had never crossed for all of history to this day. So Juan Ferrer leaves Majorca full of hope and is never heard from again. So why do we mention just another trip that failed, going to Cape Bojador, right? Why is this time different? That's because a few decades later, the Catalan Atlas is drawn by a Jewish cartographer from Majorca named Abraham Cresques. It's a map of the world, or a mappa mundi. It's one of the most influential maps in world history, credited with inspiring the Age of Discovery and described by some historians as the most important map of the Middle Ages. It's a beautiful piece of hand-drawn work with incredible detail spanning 8 foldable pages. It takes into account the adventures of Marco Polo. It serves as an expansion of the consciousness of Europeans in a huge way. It's the first time that Asia is shown as a whole continent in a map. It's like the first time you ever heard about outer space as a kid. It just takes your mind to places that you never dreamt it could go. And this is the medieval equivalent of that for Europe. It would be the first map to show a compass rose. And interestingly, while it's aware of China tens of thousands of kilometers to the east, it isn't even aware of Central Africa, more or less right next to Europe. Right? Marco Polo went to China by foot, taking years. He came back on a Chinese boat. He visited India as well. His stories opened up the consciousness of Europeans to technologies and worlds that they never could have dreamed of. But nobody had explored Africa in a determined way, so there just isn't much there. But, as an exception, it's Juan Ferrer. Juan Ferrer is shown on a tiny little boat near Cape Bojador, which is towards the end of the map on the southwest edge of the map, like the edge of a video game map. He's shown trying to cross Cape Bojador. I forget exactly what the text says next to his boat. Something like, "To the great adventure of Juan Ferrer, who went looking for the river of gold." And speaking of the river and gold, guess who else made it onto this map? Holding a gold scepter, drawn in a clearly alluring way, Mansa Musa himself. So our man, Mansa Musa, takes this trip and inspires the most important map of the Middle Ages. Right? Everyone knows that Marco Polo was a huge influence on the Age of Discovery, but nobody really mentions Mansa Musa. So both Mansa Musa and the man who went looking for him end up on this map, and this coincides with an event that propels Europe to being a place desperate to find a solution and to get out of its predicament. In the mid-1300s, around the time where these maps were being made, the bubonic plague hits Europe. The Black Plague, the Black Death. The plague is a fascinating topic that deserves its own season, but along with killing double-digit percentages of the population, it leads to the closure of various gold and silver mines. Now Europe needs people, they need gold, and lucky for them, there's a famous place and a king who has both. To recount the events, Juan Ferrer leaves in 1346, the bubonic plague does its damage in the 1350s, and the Catalan Atlas is drawn in 1375, paying tribute to Juan Ferrer and to the Gold King. His kingdom is paradise that can solve all the problems of the world, so he's achieved his dream to be known far and wide and to become famous, albeit in a different part of the world than he had intended. But be careful what you wish for. A new and rising king in Portugal, desperate for people, desperate for gold, locked in an eternal struggle with the Muslims and losing, this king with all these problems on his hand is named Enrique, or Henry the Navigator. And he's credited as the man who begins the Age of Discovery. He's going to make it his life's mission, and the life mission of a few other interesting people, and so will other European countries soon to follow, to discover Mansa Musa's river of gold. The race is on, and we're going to follow it. This is Ashrit Parvangada's Tipping Points. See you next time.